So, hello, Em, and welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me today to talk about something that hasn't been covered on the Cult Vault podcast before, but has been referenced to in a previous episode with friend of the Cult Vault, Krista, who came to speak to us about River Road Fellowship. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. My name is M. Thomas, and I grew up in a high control, um, sort of Pentecostal cult called the Way International, which was a incredibly large organization at one point in time. At its height, there were about 100,000 members throughout the world. Um, it has since diminished considerably for a variety of reasons that we'll get into. And I was excommunicated. So I'm just living my best life and trying to recover from, years of the systematic control and figure out what brings me joy.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning more about the Way International. And I'm just looking, but above you, it looks like you have a couch on your ceiling. What is this?
Yes. So the previous owners did a lot of like DIY things. And I guess that they didn't like looking at the exposed ductwork that's down in our partially finished basement. And rather than putting in a ceiling, they just like staple gun some fabric up there.
You should set up a podcast studio in there because couch cushions on the ceiling, I reckon, would be a good buffer against any echoing and any sound.
It does
So,
help.
the Way International, I have read a bit about the Way, but I don't know too much. So, could you give us an overview of the history of the Way International, who founded the movement, and where you enter into that timeline?
Yeah. So I have quite a comprehensive timeline sort of written out for myself. And so if you want me to like streamline things, definitely let me know. But
No, give us the whole hog.
okay. So the Way International was founded by Victor Paul Werewolf. He was born on December 31st, 1916. So goes way back. Um, he ultimately went and attended college at Lakeland College and got a bachelor's degree there. He graduated in 1937. In that time, he did get married when he was about 20 years old, and he remained married to the same woman through the rest of his life. He graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary in 1941 with a master's in practical theology. At that point, he did trial sermons in Payne, Ohio for the Evangelical and Reformed Church. And then this is where things start to get interesting. In September of 1942, Victor Paul Werewolf claims that God spoke to him and said that he, meaning God, would teach Victor Paul Werewolf his word like it had not been known since the first century if Victor Paul Werewolf would teach it to others. He then claimed that he required proof from God that he was in fact God and this was true, and asked to see it snow, at which point he opened his eyes and saw a veritable blizzard outside his window. And this is how he knew that God was speaking to him, and he was in fact being delivered the word as it was meant to be heard. So that is sort of the start with this grandiose claim. And then in October of that year, so about a month later, his first radio broadcast was put out there. And that's how the Way got started. It was called Vesper Chimes, or the Chimes Hour Youth Caravan. And he went ahead and did that radio broadcast up until 1948. And then at this point, he was issued a doctorate, and I'm using air quotes. No one can see me doing that. But this is key, is that he claims he got a doctorate from Pikes Peak Seminary, which is an organization that was lacking accreditation or any formal classes. And from that point forward, he called himself Dr. Victor Paul Werewolf. And all of the books that he published, that's his name on the covers. So he really stuck with that lie. He then claims that he attended Moody Bible School's correspondence program, Moody Bible School did in fact exist, and they have refuted that claim and said that he never attended any of their courses whatsoever. In 1951, he started doing missionary work in Honduras. And then he attended a full gospel rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was an evangelical rally. And again, there's a claim about snow. So he claimed that he was getting ready to leave the rally in frustration, and a snowstorm blocked him in the city, at which point he went back to the rally and was taught to speak in tongues by J.E. Stiles, who was an evangelical figurehead at that time. You can look back to the date in 1951, and there was no snow. It is not documented in any way, shape, or form, unsurprisingly. But speaking in tongues would go on to become a core tenet of the Way International's belief system. In 1953, he found out about B.G. Leonard, who is another evangelical figurehead, and pushed his way into a class that he was teaching that was full. But he was very charismatic and talked his way in. It was called the Gifts of the Spirit class. And he took the class twice, bringing multiple people in with him. In 1953, he then ran his first Receiving the Holy Spirit Today classes, which was heavily based on B.G. Leonard's work. Later, he added in J.E. Stiles' work on Gifts of the Spirit, and another guy, Bullinger, I forget his first name, but Bullinger also worked on information on the Holy Spirit and wrote something called How to Enjoy the Bible. So he took work from J.E. Stiles, B.G. Leonard, and Bullinger, and created his own course called Power for Abundant Living, which was essentially plagiarized. But Power for Abundant Living was the foundational course of the organization and would go on to be taught to hundreds of thousands of people. He self-published a bunch of books. He started recording his Power for Abundant Living classes. More and more people were flocking. And then in 1955, up until 1957, he took his wife and his oldest son on a tour of mission fields in India with the Evangelical and Reformed Church. He left his youngest son at home during that time for 2 years. In 1957, when he returned, he cut his ties with the Evangelical and Reformed Church and took his Power for Abundant Living class with him. So he took all those materials and went like, these are mine. I'm going to market these. He was able to buy out his family farm with the help of one of his brothers and declared it a property of the Way, which was a church organization and thus tax exempt. He did live at headquarters on this property until his death. In 1959, he started running summer camp in Wisconsin. In 1960, he added one in Indiana. In 1961, he had finished the farm, totally refurbished enough to move there, and started teaching official summer camps at Way headquarters, which still exists in New Knoxville, Ohio. In 1962, he moved everything to the farm and began teaching all of his classes on location. And in 1953, he started filming sessions called The Teacher, which would later become the Power for Abundant Living film. In 1967, he published Are the Dead Alive Now? And filmed the final version of Power for Abundant Living. And at that point, he had just had tens of thousands of people flock to him. And he really took advantage of sort of the free love hippie movement. You'll find as we talk about the Way that there wasn't a purity culture emphasis as there are in many Christian cults for a variety of reasons, but one of which was the population of people that he was gathering to himself that really would have probably limited his membership if he had hit the purity culture thing hard. And at that point, he had people on both coasts. He had sizable membership on both sides of the country. And he instituted a policy that all tithing, which again, tithing becomes an important component, but all tithing would go to headquarters, no exceptions. So people outside of headquarters who were part of the organization within home ministries and things were not receiving any of this tithing. It was all going directly to New Knoxville. And he did require 10% tithing of income from all membership. And then that same time, he made his first attempt at the Way Corps, which would become the leadership program for the Way International. And the Way Corps does still exist today in slightly different form, but has very stringent requirements for membership as it did originally. People have to show that they have a certain amount of money in the bank. They have to show that they can kind of payroll themselves for the duration of their education. You can get sponsored by other people if you can't payroll yourself. And when you get sponsored, of course, then you have the added pressure of sticking through it because someone else is paying your way. And it is kind of like a lifetime commitment. Like if you go through the whole Way Corps program, the concept is that you're in it for life. You are going to be leadership in the way. There's lots of room for growth. There's boards of trustees. There's the Way Corps director position. There are branch leadership positions, which, you know, branches refer to basically all of the fellowships within a certain jurisdiction or area. And at this point, back in 1969, Victor Paul Werewolf started talking a lot about condemning rock and roll music, musicians and celebrities that were kind of quote unquote out there. He said that all musicians were possessed by devil spirits. And he began his own like Way Corps band, and that was the music that you were supposed to listen to. He taught the myth of the 6 million, so the Holocaust was a fake. He was very serious about defending from communists. There were guns, there was weapons training. The the Waco thing kind of blew all of that up, and at that point, they kind of backed off on advertising their firearms training and having firearms. But it was a big point of contention for a lot of people. I mean, as it should have been. In 1971, on top of the Way Corps program, he rolled out what was called the WOW Ambassador program. And so the WOW Ambassador program had strict requirements for entry, but was less intensive. It was only a year commitment. And those folks he sent out to live in specific areas of the world to go and minister and recruit. And then he put out the Orange Book, which all of the books have colors. There's the blue book, there's the orange book, but the orange book was called The Power for Abundant Living, and this was his first self-published, like full book that condensed all of the varied things he had been plagiarizing and teaching with different verbiage for like the last, I don't know, decade and a half. He had pamphlets that he was handing out at colleges. He kept publishing. The thing about the Way in general is that it's sort of like multi-level marketing inside of a Christian cult. So there's all this religion, but you also have to buy in to advance yourself. So you start by paying like $200 or whatever for the foundational class, The Power for Abundant Living. And then each class you pay more and more money. You can go on vacations to Camp Gunnison in Colorado with your family and pay money for a bunch of family entertainment. You have to buy all of his books. For a long time, there was a week-long Christian festival called the Rock of Ages, which took place at headquarters, and you had to pay money to attend with your family, and you drove from wherever you were, and you had to spend money on food, and you had to invest and really prove yourself. And so basically every year he published something new up until about 1982, at which point his health started declining. But he went so far as to teach something called the Christian Family and Sex class. And this will be another important point in here. So, the Christian Family and Sex class was something that he taught himself. And it was a class in which he essentially taught women how to be wives, how to have sex with their husbands. He did give sex tips. He taught people how to parent within that class and how to raise their children with obedience. You can imagine how obedience was garnered. His classes, when he was the one doing the teaching, were very explicit. Um, and he would actually show pornography to the attendees. That was pretty extreme. So he would show bestiality porn during these, and especially pornography that conflated homosexuality and bestiality, because homophobia is a, another sort of like core belief in the way, it always has been. And he did a lot of things that conflated, pretty despicable sex acts with homosexuality. And his rationality for showing these things in this class was that it could prepare attendees for fighting off devil spirits, because if they could no longer be shocked by this type of sexual content, then the adversary, the devil, couldn't necessarily get a hold on them in the same way. So it was actually to defend them against like sexual vulnerabilities. But I have been in contact with someone who was actually 13 years old when she attended this. So it is verified that he used these methods. It is verified that underage girls attended these. And it is certainly verified that this was a highly traumatic class for people. And it wasn't until after Craig Martindale, who we'll get to in a little bit, took over, that they eliminated some of the more highly sexualized components of this class. And ultimately, they just kept revamping it to be more palatable as time went on. I don't know if right now, currently, they still teach this class in some format. But when we were Mark and Avoid or excommunicated in 2000, they were still teaching it in a more palatable, digestible way. So he really inserted himself into every aspect of life. He had tithing, he had parenting rules, he had marriage rules, he had sex rules, he had a lot of beliefs about Jews and homosexuals both being equally evil. I grew up around a very racially diverse group of people. Our fellowship in particular, there were families that were Black, there were families that were Latinx. Um, and in my experience, it didn't feel like there was a lot of racism, but I have zero doubts that there were. I was looking at this through a child's eyes. These people helped raise me because, your fellowship is basically like your family. So in my mind, like everybody was equal, but I have zero doubts that there was a lot of racism that also permeated things. I think Victor Paul Werrell was just always looking for people that he could put underneath himself. So women, children, homosexuals, Jews, and I'm sure people of color. So there was just a lot of hate mixed in with what was supposed to be a lot of love. As Victor Paul Werrell aged, he ended up inserting L. Craig Martindale, who was the Way Corps director, as president um, on their 40th anniversary. So 1982 was the 40th anniversary of the Way. And at that point, he installed L. Craig Martindale. And the last time that he taught Power for Abundant Living was actually in 1984. It was done live at Camp Gunnison in um, Colorado. And at that point, he had expanded all over the world. He had a jet. He had his own jet, by the way. This is like a multi-million-dollar organization, and he would fly to all of the locations. There was a big one in Scotland. There was one in the UK, Canada, Mexico, Spain. He really was international, and he was pulling in tithing to headquarters from all over the world for the duration of his life. Um, He did pass away in 1985 at the age of 68. According to his death certificate, the cause was cancer of the liver and the eye. And he claimed that he got the cancer of the eye from the lights under which he filmed Power for Abundant Living. So he sacrificed his sight and his life to put the true word of God out into the world. Um, so that's bullet points essentially of Victor Paul Werewolf. Um, Really interesting, very controlling man, very misogynistic man. It later came out that there were a lot of sexual assault and abuse allegations about him. There were a lot of married women he was sleeping with who were married to Waycore leadership. And it was just kind of like one of these known things that people tolerated. He's been quoted as saying that, like, by sexually favoring him, they were favoring God. So really talked his way into bed with a lot of women. Um, and that behavior was continued by leadership when Craig Martindale took over. So I was born in 1985. So the entirety of my time in the way, which was up until 2000, when Craig Martindale was booted, was under Craig Martindale's leadership. And a lot of people will say that this is the point where the way splintered and weakened, and that Craig Martindale was the adversary getting his foot in the door. Because as extreme as Victor Paul Werewolf was, Craig Martindale took it to a whole new level.
Right, right, right. It's kind of like what people expressed in the Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey documentary. They said Rulon Jeffs, there were issues with his leadership, but when Warren Jeffs took over, the abuses became more extreme and the control measures became more extreme. It seems like this werewolf figure is really adopting parts out of every cult playbook. You reeled off so many different things that he was using, and I am interested in his position on not being drafted into the war, because 1942, the prominent kind of implementation of his plans, that was the year that I believe, and someone please correct me if I'm wrong. 1942 was the year that 18 to 64-year-olds in America were required to sign up to be drafted into service. So I don't know if it was his position as a clergyman or a religious figure that made him exempt from being drafted. But was it something like 30, 50 million American men were drafted into that war. So how he wasn't a part of that is interesting. Being born 1916 around the First World War and then starting this ministry in the Second World War is just an interesting point in history for this to happen. And then, of course, appropriating the hippie movement and saying, you can have free love and a relationship with Christ, and that's okay. And then later on, when everybody's involved and everybody's like, we're on board, and he's controlling everything, the the goalposts are then moved, and oh, actually no, we are going to change things. It's not as free love as I once said it was, because you can only have relationships that I deem to be appropriate, which is basically him with anyone he wants, which is of course the most heinous form of sexual exploitation. And this is just the first part. What an incredible introduction to this whole movement, and it really was international, as you said. So please continue. This is amazing stuff. Thank you, Em.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be sharing this because the way has been very litigious and they have a lot of resources. And so they are not a well-known organization, despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of people took the Power for Abundant Living class, and like literally 100,000 people were at peak membership. If you Google it, like, you can find Washington Post articles from the 80s, but there's really nothing current aside from former membership being on a variety of forums. And even that is difficult to find if you don't have like the right keywords to look
Yeah,
for.
yeah. It
Um,
also feels like nothing that Werewolf was offering was original. He attended other people's sermons and courses, and had this theological education and kind of cherry picked what he could see was effective and then turned it into his own teachings, which is what, interestingly, Victor Barnard did when he broke away from the Way International and started River Road Fellowship, which Krista has been on the show to tell us about. So you can trace all of this back to religious fraud, basically.
yeah, and I say interestingly, but it's more like disgustingly and sadly, like every splinter organization, of which there ended up being many, there are sexual abuse and misconduct allegations in pretty much every one. And Victor Barnard is probably an extreme example. But I will say that as we get into my personal story, you'll see how prevalent grooming and sexual abuse were within the way itself. And Victor Ware will certainly set the stage for that. And whether that was like one of his main motivations for forming this organization, that's up for debate, but I certainly don't doubt that that's a factor. And I do think that he was a coward. I think he was avoiding a lot of things, hiding behind the way and hiding behind his position as a clergy person, getting his nonprofit like church status, avoiding taxes, just hiding behind these bodies of the people he was putting out into the world while he was sitting pretty in his jet, flying from country to country and sleeping with people's wives. And I think it's just really consistent across cult leadership that they're somehow managed to get out of things like military service. They somehow managed to get out of like day to day, work because they're able to be charismatic enough to make other people do it. And then they take these vulnerable people and they instill all of these ideals into them. This indoctrination is so thorough. And when you take somebody like Craig Martindale, who had been involved in Christian organization at college and went to a Way meeting on campus, because one of the big ways that Way recruited was actually just like military recruiters, is they had recruiters on college campuses, which I know is another kind of common tactic, but they still do it at colleges in Ohio. I found a Reddit thread recently about it. Like, this is one of the things that they have kind of perfected over the years. So that's kind of where Craig Martindale came from. He was born in 1984, and by the time he was in college at the University of Kansas, he had become a leader in the Fellowship of Christian Athletes there. He was a football player. And he got a bachelor's degree in psychology from there, which I also think is really important. Because, of course, when you understand how people learn and what motivating operations are, you're much more able to manipulate things. And you're also, I think, able to kind of point out and easily find weaknesses within people to take advantage of and exploit. So there was a Way meeting on his college campus where he heard a WOW ambassador, so one of these folks who was out in the world ministering, he heard them speak. And then he was so intrigued by it that he went and actually saw Victor Paul Werewolf himself teach, and he immediately signed up for the Way is Power for Abundant Living class and then joined the Way in 1971. He quickly became the Way Corps director. Victor Paul Werewolf kind of cherry picked him and was like, this is the guy. I'm going to put him in leadership and see what he does. So he was the Way Corps director until he took over the presidency in 1982. He, at that time during his presidency, published articles in the Way magazine, which you can't find any of his articles credited on their website. But there's a lot of like uncredited articles from old Way magazine, not episodes, that's not the right word, old Way magazine publications that there isn't an author attached to. And so part of me wonders if they just took his stuff and took his name off of it because he pretty much ended up disgracing them. But he also wrote a book called The Rise and Expansion of the Christian Church in the First Century, which you can still find on Amazon along with Paul Werewolf's works. So what ended up really happening, which people refer to as like the nosedive or the schism in the Way, is that Chris Greer, who was leadership in the UK and also had a close relationship with Victor Paul Werewolf, about a year after his death, published and read to Way leadership and Way Corps, like live, something he called the Passing of the Patriarch, which was a very long document outlining Werewolf's last days, including criticisms of the Board of Trustees and allegations of unbiblical decisions and behavior on Craig Martindale's part. And so Craig Martindale was chosen as president. Chris Gear was, still in leadership, but had sort of fallen behind Craig Martindale. And then he decides that he's going to go ahead and publish and share this document in which Craig Martindale is heavily criticized by Victor Poe Werewolf. So at that time, things started splitting. Members of Way Corps, members of the board, Chris Greer himself started separating from the Way, which is really where you start to get those first splinter organizations. And in 1989, Craig Martindale did a series of talks in which he started explaining his reasoning and his actions. And he sent out a letter calling for an oath of allegiance from every member of the Way Corps. So every Way Corps member had to sign an oath of allegiance and mail it back to him in
My
order
goodness.
to, yeah, in order to maintain their positions.
Yes, I
And
did all of these things, but I still want you to follow me, and I want you to sign this document to say that you will.
yes, yes, that's exactly it. And so then he took all of this, he took all of his explanations, and he created his own class called the Galatians tapes. And then that turned into something called Leadership Tapes 1 and 2. In these tapes, he likens Greer and other leaders who left the Way to the miserable comforters of Job and accused them of being possessed with various devil spirits. So he was basically like, well, they didn't sign the oath, so they must be possessed by devil spirits. Devil spirits are like this big component of the belief systems as well.
Gosh.
And so, anything can be caused by a devil spirit, including splintering away from the Way.
Oh no. I guess that's the miserable comforters of Job. Would that be Job?
Yes, yes.
Oh gosh. I don't know enough about the Bible, but this is two people fighting with each other over the most trivial things. Power. Well,
Yes.
power's not that trivial, so
Yeah, sex and power, money. That's I think a lot of what it comes down to. And then believing that you are a true disciple of Victor Poe Werewolf and the other one isn't, and you're adhering to Victor Poe Werewolf's visions and interpretation of the Bible. Which, if we go back to the beginning of this story, Victor Poe Werewolf was given the word of God in the way it was meant to be interpreted, and that's the foundation of all of this. So Greer saying that, Victor Poe Werewolf accused Craig Martindale of moving away from the true interpretation. And so honestly, it's a bit like a dick measuring contest,
yeah, I
to be
was gonna say,
honest.
I was gonna say that, but I didn't want to be but you've said it now, so it's out there. The two
Yeah.
men, and I said fighting over trivial things, but what I was thinking was that, yeah.
Yeah. So things got really intense. And in 1992, Craig Martindale filmed a new class called Defeating the Adversary, which parts of it were taken from those leadership seminars, and other parts of it were just honestly him spinning out of control. So at that point, he started taking out of curriculum classes, books, music, or references to leaders who had been removed. In the mid 90s, he started replacing classes and programs, and doctrines of Victor Poe Werewolf. And he actually filmed his own version of the advanced class, which replaced Power for Abundant Living, called The Way of Abundance and Power. So just
This feels like the adversaries are not, the seven deadly sins. It's not looking at things like gluttony. It's not looking at Satan and Satan's influences and rock music. It's actually looking at other people who are also practicing the same things that you're kind of practicing, but not in the right way.
yes, that is a perfect interpretation of it, is like, and that's why it's called the Way, because it is the way, the only way. The big thing was the word of God is the will of God. like that was the words I grew up with constantly like jangling around in my head. And so when Victor Paul Werewolf passed, there was no one to rein Craig Martindale in, and he just turned this into his own interpretation of Victor Paul Werewolf's interpretation. But because he was situated by Victor Paul Werewolf, that made him the new authority. And he just continued to replace things. Um, and he started sending out additional letters. So he sent out that demand for loyalty. He sent out another letter about the fog years. So the fog years are the years prior to his split from Chris Greer, and now he sees through the fog. Um, and having like a positive look forward into the 90s. He started really focusing on debt and sending out messages about how no one could be in debt and be in leadership. Um, he called open season on anybody in the Way Corps who said anything against him or the trustees. And he basically, in the last year of the Rock of Ages, started really putting all this stuff out there. And I think the Rock of Ages got canceled for a variety of reasons. I haven't been able to like totally find why, but because it was like this large festival where it was just a free for all, there were thousands of families hanging out in campers for a week on this huge property. And there was children's fellowship, there was his sermons, there was Waycore band music. There was the Athletes of the Spirit, which we'll also have to get into at some point, which was essentially like a Saturday Night Fever for devil spirits. There was dry ice, there was spandex, there was dancing. He gets progressively more and more naked because he cast himself in the lead role. And as he defeats the adversary, he ends up in like this wrestling onesie with rainbows all over it, and there's nipples, and he's like greased
Oh
up and
my
shiny.
goodness.
Yeah, he really goes off the deep end. He starts telling women in the Way Corps how they can marry because there were limited men in the Way Corps. Um, and then he declared his war on homosexuals essentially the last year of the Rock of Ages. He just went off. And he essentially created a witch hunt for homosexuals within Waycore and the organization as a whole. The letter that he published that you can still find, um, you can see some excerpts on my social media from this letter. But the language is so vile that I really can't even get myself to read it aloud. Um,
Why so much energy and focus on this particular thing? It makes me question whether there was some level of projection of some type.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. Victor Prohuero really had a strong stance against homosexuality,
Yeah.
but he left room for people to redeem themselves and to cast out that devil spirit and to become whole spiritual warriors and to return to the way. And Craig Martindale just put in this like no tolerance sort of stance. One thing that he did say within this letter that I can quote because there are no horrific slurs in it. But he says, "You should be thankful you're not in Old Testament times because there are some of us who would gladly execute you."
Wow. Oh my
That's a
goodness.
direct quote from leadership. So he was just getting more and more violent, more and more aggressive, more and more extreme. Um, and this is what I was really growing up under was like this serious control, dress codes, marriage parameters, increased tithing, all these financial cutbacks, replacement of all of these programs, and like this intense homophobic vitriol, which my parents have admitted they wished they hadn't raised me with quite that level of hatred, but they did choose to stay in during that time. So, what are you going to do? So, I'm a little queer kid. I'm living under this. And these ideas that are being shoved at me just continue to get more and more extreme. Um, and ultimately, his biggest change to the doctrine of Victor Paul Werewolf goes back to homosexuality. And he declared that original sin of mankind in Genesis was not Eve eating the apple, but it was in fact Eve having lesbian sex to the devil who had come into concentration as a woman. And just digest that one for a second.
The that is the ultimate interpretation of a section of the Bible. If you were looking to change everything, you go back to the origin story. You go back to the very beginning and you say, oh, actually, I can tell you why this is wrong. And it goes all the way back to the fall of man.
Yeah, yeah. And,
Wow.
Victor Paul Werrell set the stage for this with the Christian family and sex class, where he's like, bestiality and lesbian sex are paired together in this class really heavily. And like, he has all this homophobic language, but then Craig Martindale, for whatever reason, has a real intense drive, this real intense homophobia. And whether that's internalized homophobia coming out in a really big way, whether he had a bad experience that nobody knows about, or whether he was just looking for someone to hate, or was truly indoctrinated in these concepts by Victor Paul Werewolf and then just took them to an extreme. I don't know. But once he declared that original sin was lesbian sex, things just continued to really devolve and go downhill. He had all these closed meetings with leadership about the infiltration of homosexuals within the organization. There was an attack by the adversary, the devil, and he started outlining steps to combat the problem, which was a lot of mark and avoid. Mark and avoid was their terms, for excommunication. And so when you were mark and avoid, they basically pretend you're dead. So you're mark and avoid, and that's it. Like everybody literally turns their back on you. You're totally shunned. And that was his really big solution for homosexuality, was to hunt everybody out and kick them out. So he lost a lot of people during all of this. So we went from 100,000 people to maybe a couple thousand, more like hundreds scattered throughout the world. And during this time, there were lawsuits. So people started stepping up and saying, I was sexually abused or assaulted by Craig Martindale or other members of leadership. And he was actually forced to step down in 2000. And he had been placed on quote unquote probation and stripped of his clergy status at that time, and was dropped out of wake horror. But he basically, like, again, like he was on probation. He could have technically redeemed himself, but that was it. That was the end of his time with the Way. And a woman named Rosalie Rivenbark succeeded him as the organization's president after that announcement. And she had been on the board of trustees prior to taking the presidency. And because we were mark and avoid by 2000, I don't really have a ton of information about what's happened in the last 20 years. What I can tell you is that the organization still very much exists. They still have these core tenets of speaking in tongues with interpretation, devil spirits and the adversary, a lot of misogyny and patriarchy, homophobia and transphobia. There's an article you can find from 2018 about, I think it's called like homosexuality, choice, not genetics. They continue to have beliefs about Jews and other Christians. They don't believe in the Trinity. They're actually not anti-abortion, which is really another thing that goes back to all of this sexual assault and abuse. They say that life doesn't start until the first breath. And so while they don't explicitly state that they're pro-choice, they say that they're pro-truth. And the truth is that abortion's okay because life doesn't start until the child is taking breaths outside of the body of the mother. And so they still hold all of these really kind of like intense, crazy beliefs, but it's very polished looking. And their membership is increasing again. They still have WACOR. They still have a form of the WOW ambassadors. They have, international locations. They're sending out ministers all over the world. And the people who are living at headquarters and are the most heavily indoctrinated are certainly victims of systematic abuse. So there's a lot going on, and like that isn't even personal experiences, those are just like facts about timeline, which is kind of
Oh my
crazy.
goodness. It is. It's like the fall of an empire. They say, what, like empires topple from the top, or empires like that crumble from the top. So this is an example of somebody that loses their grasp on everything, um perhaps even reality, of some kind. It's unfathomable for me to even begin to consider what a person experiences when their leader gives a talk condemning their existence. So you have LGBTQIA individuals within these communities that are listening to this hate speech, and then what, questioning your entire existence, questioning what you did wrong, or why do I feel this way if it's a choice, and my family have these beliefs and ideals as well. It's awful to consider the environments that individuals must have been living in. And I wonder if, well, no, I mean, that's like a whole other episode. But with this particular timeline, you're born in 85. So, oh no, you missed Werewolf's final public speech. But
I
you
did.
mentioned that your first memories of Werewolf were seeing a brass statue of him at
Yep.
the farm at headquarters.
Yeah. He was practically worshipped. So he heavily condemned idolatry. He said Catholicism was just idolatry. Anybody who had, paintings, statues, crucifixion stuff, saints, the Virgin Mary, all of that stuff was seen as idolatry by him. And yet there is a giant bronze statue of him at headquarters. Um, and he's holding open a Bible with like one hand in the air, like preaching in this statue. It's very like lifelike. But we would literally like we went to headquarters a lot. My father was a fellowship leader, and we would visit the freaking statue every time we went. So he basically, in the structure of the way, it was all based on the concept of like a tree. And so, like, the roots are God, the trunk is Victor Werewolf and the organization. The branches refer to like the different areas and jurisdictions. And then twigs were the in home fellowship groups that made up the branches. And then the leaves were the individual members of the way. So, like, this is all based on like this tree of life.
That's so funny because for a second I thought you were describing the statue, and I was like, that sounds terrifying.
Well,
the
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 stat
trunk is the body of Victor Werewolf. That sounds so scary.
I mean, there is like a giant tree thing behind the statue. So, he's like intrinsically connected to like the formation of this organization. But, he's very much like a figurehead, but also I think was in a lot of ways worshipped by original membership. Speaking for my parents in particular, my father, he did have a personal relationship with Victor Paul Werewolf, and like I think saw him as like a father figure in a lot of ways. And so was like heavily, heavily indoctrinated. He was in Waycor. He traveled all over the country. He taught Power for Abundant Living classes all under, the guidance of Victor Paul Werewolf. He became a fellowship leader, and he even met my mother while teaching her how to speak in tongues. Like heavily, heavily indoctrinated. Really had this very glowing view of Victor Paul Werrell. He was pretty infallible as far as my father was concerned. And when he talks about the way, he talks about how, Craig Martindale dragged it down. But I was born in 1985. We weren't totally done with the way till 2000. So he still spent 15 years trying to hang on to these like vestiges of Victor Paul Werewolf and the glory days of the way. So people
Yeah.
were heavily, heavily indoctrinated and attached.
Well, Victor Werewolf basically came forward and said that he was like the born again Messiah. He talked about having this connection to God, or that he was God, and people looking at him must have truly thought he was infallible if this was the belief system that Werewolf was implementing in those earliest days. So then having somebody else come in and change all of those things must have been a really tough adjustment for the early members who were still very committed to the cause.
Yeah, I think it was. And that's where you got things like River Road Fellowship and other splinter groups of like, this is not Victor Paul Werewolf's interpretation of the word anymore. Craig Martindale has taken this down his own path. And therefore, I'm going to go and start my own organization that stays closer to the true word of God. And, all of these splinter organizations still exist. We all know that River Road Fellowship would still exist if those really brave women hadn't come forward about Victor Paul Barnard. That would still absolutely be going on. And while his abuse of women and children was very systematic, there's a lot of sexual abuse in pretty much every splinter organization that is more subtle. There aren't maidens, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of victims.
Mm-hmm. And it speaks to those splinter groups adopting those early belief systems and adopting the methods that were used by Werewolf, who was abusive in nature himself. So if people are saying, oh, we're going to move away and we're going to stay true to the teachings, it's almost like a cycle of abuse, a repeated pattern of behavior. So it's quite scary to consider how many of these groups exist or have existed, and the types of environments that have been cultivated within those systems that we might never hear about. Um, if anybody else listening has an experience like this and can speak to these splinter groups, it would be it would be really powerful to create a network of conversations that draw these things together and allow people to share those parallel experiences. But you're born in 85. Your parents have met within the Way International. What are your early memories of life inside the Way?
They're not great. I'm sure you'll put trigger warnings at the beginning of all of this. I know that you routinely do that, but I just feel the need to like put a heavy trigger warning on the rest of this because my story is pretty intense on a lot of levels, both at my home and within the organization. So there's a lot of physical, sexual, spiritual abuse that I'm going to talk about. Um, I've done a lot of therapy, so I'm pretty okay talking about all this stuff now, but I do sometimes like need a moment, so I appreciate that. So, my first memories are fellowship in my house. We had fellowship in our home 3 days a week that my father led. And so I think my earliest memories, I'm probably about four. And I was one of the first children in our fellowship. And so there wasn't necessarily originally like a children's fellowship, and I would be part of the adult fellowship. So I had to basically like learn to sit quietly and entertain myself for hours on end while all of this preaching and speaking in tongues was going on. Within the structure of the Way, we had our in-home fellowships, and then because my dad was a fellowship leader, we would go to monthly branch meetings. So everybody who was a fellowship leader in our area got together once a month with their families, usually in like a rented hall of some kind because there were too many people to be like in someone's home. And then we would routinely go out to headquarters in Ohio for prolonged periods and like stay in a camper. And that included the Rock of Ages. So the Rock of Ages, I spent from birth until the last one in 1994 or five. So I went to like all 10 of them while I was alive. And in all of this, there's sort of immediate indoctrination that women are there to serve men and that bodily autonomy doesn't exist. So, if you read some of the Washington Post articles, it's actually the way is referred to as the kissing cult, because women had to kiss men on the mouth in greeting. And so when I was as young as four, I was kissing men on the mouth when saying hello. And so that was sort of the first part of grooming is like, this is just normal that you are, as a child, kissing adult men. And that these adult men and women can, rub your back, pet your hair, kiss you, hold you, and they can also correct you. So if your parents aren't directly present, you're to, treat everybody in your fellowship or at a branch meeting or at the Rock of Ages, any adult can take the role of your parent and punish you if you're not behaving well. So there was just no room to say no. There was no room to develop judgment. There was no room to experiment in the ways I think are healthy for children to figure out who they are and what's comfortable to them. Touch was just mandatory and punishment was mandatory. It was referred to as the rod of correction. And, during larger group children's fellowship, the adult who was responsible for children's fellowship rotated. So if there was a large group of us children, we would be put in another room with a random adult. Sometimes that adult was, an older teenager. Sometimes they were in their 60s. Some of them were parents, some of them weren't, but they were responsible for keeping us quiet and obedient during children's fellowship. So, a lot of parenting decisions were shared in that way and weren't really questioned. So if somebody spanked you, and they weren't your parent, it wasn't like, oh my God, why'd you spank my child? It was like, oh my God, what'd you do to get the spanking?
That's impossible. Every person has an idea in their mind of what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and what isn't. And this is just it on a societal scale. In this type of self-sealed, enclosed environment, what your parents might not deem punishable, another person might. So how can you expect a group of children with all of these different people taking care of them all of the time to ever understand what their boundaries are, what the expectations are for them and their behavior? I mean, of course, none of these restrictions should be in place for children, and none of this type of behavior around children is appropriate. But did you ever find yourself having to be a different person depending on who was taking care of you? Like, oh, I know that that person is not going to punish me for having extra food or playing for 10 minutes longer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the interesting thing about the way and other groups like it are that I was in the public school system. So I had to be a student that excelled and that basically was attractive to other parents and attractive to other students that were quote unquote worldly. And then within the way, I had to be the very obedient, subservient fellowship leader's daughter. And like, certainly different adults have different expectations. Um, and, I was an eldest child, I was a Spitfire. Um, and that really got punished out of me at a very early age. So I think probably a turning point for me, I was about five, And we were at a branch meeting, and my father was introducing us to this man, and I just did not want to kiss him. Like, I just did not want to kiss this particular man. And I said no and embarrassed my father terribly. Um, Ultimately, I was forced to kiss the man. And then when we got home, I was actually spanked with the Bible. And that was like this definitive moment for me of like, wow, I really can't express myself. I can't hold a boundary. I can't say no. And it was really confusing because out in the world, you know, all of these children are exploring boundary setting and saying no and
Yeah.
having bodily autonomy.
It's part of growing up, isn't it? Pushing those boundaries, you know. You need to push your boundaries to recognize where they are so that you can take risks but stay safe. And I imagine in these environments when you grow up being told certain things, taught certain things with certain expectations, that there might not be an understanding of what is right and wrong in wider society. But in public school, the teachers aren't all kissing the students and the pupils on the mouth and touching the kids in a certain way. And I think every person still has that internalized reaction. So you saying you don't want to kiss a particular person on the mouth is probably just your younger instincts of trying to keep yourself safe.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, the unfortunate thing is that I, as self-protecting a self-protecting child, I really learned to read people and social cues so that I could try to predict my environment and predict what my behavior should be. So, you know, in class and around teachers, I was always, you know, very well behaved. Every parent, every teacher, why can't you be more like Emily? I want my students to be like Emily. I want my child to be like Emily. Like, that was the whole point. I had really high grades. I excelled in athletics. And I was pretty much taught that I could be present for worldly things, but not participate in them. And so I would make friends who were doing normal kid stuff that I couldn't participate in. And then my parents would meet their parents, they would witness to them, they try to get them to come into fellowship. And I'd either end up with another member of fellowship or I'd end up with a person being like, whoa, that person and her family's super weird. Like, so I was the weird kid. I was the kid without physical boundaries. But because most people, most adults don't push boundaries in the way that I was taught was okay, I was relatively safe until I wasn't. So it really also left me kind of vulnerable to ongoing abuse outside of the organization because I was a child that didn't know that I could say, hey, don't touch me. So, you know, it left me open to predation in other areas as well. So I had a lot of conflict. I had a lot of abuse happening. And certainly because of the way I was raised within the cult, I wasn't like, hey, so and so down the street is touching me inappropriately. Like, that wasn't something I could or even knew how to do because in my mind, it wasn't even inappropriate. Um, so the lack of physical boundaries and bodily autonomy, the type of grooming that takes place, is just immediate. Like, there was no like you hit a certain age and then you start to become like sexually indoctrinated. It was just like, here you are. And the homophobia was also like immediate. And when I started to recognize that I wasn't interested in boys in the way that other girls were, and I started to hear all of this intense homophobia, um, you know, I really tried to make up for it. I really tried to push all of that down and be like compulsively heteronormative. And I think as my parents started to recognize those tendencies within myself, those quote unquote like tomboy things, which in one hand were encouraged because again, I was like a very high end athlete. And on the other hand, were discouraged in every other context. They started really talking about, I don't know, I was at Rock of Ages, my dad, and was hanging out with old Waycore friends. One of them had a son, and they were just like, not that there were arranged marriages within the way, but they were like, go play with this boy. You
Mm.
could marry him one day. And I was like 8 or 9 when I was hearing this. So it was just like they were immediately trying to like mask my potential like homosexual tendencies by like pairing me with boys as like playmates and friends. Um, and that continued all through my teen years. I was set up by my father with men up until I was like 17. So it was really difficult to figure myself out and figure out my sexual orientation and not just live in constant terror because not only was I gay and that was wrong and Craig Martindale hated it, but like the source of homosexuality or really anything undesirable was devil spirits and being possessed by devil spirits. And so in my little child mind, I was like, man, I'm having these thoughts about girls. I've got a devil spirit inside of me. And the only way to get rid of that devil spirit is to have it cast out by somebody. But in order to have that happen, I have to tell my dad
Yes.
that the devil spirit exists. And so it was just like this life of like constant masking and hiding, and just not understanding that I could defend myself. Or really, it wasn't even understanding that I could, it was just knowing that I couldn't because it was punished so heavily. And so I was really trapped. And all children within the way are trapped and put into sort of these boxes. But for LGBTQ plus kids in particular, the terror that came along with it, and really being shoved into these boxes in which we didn't technically fit, and just living with this constant looming devil spirit over our head was so stifling and so heavily indoctrinated that even now, as a 37-year-old person, I still have these moments where I'm out in public with my wife and we're like holding hands and I'm just waiting for God to strike me down, or I'm just waiting for people to literally throw stones at us. Like somebody's staring at us and I'm like, okay, this is it. We're going to get attacked. Um, and I can talk myself out of those things with logic and lots of therapy and different coping strategies now. But like that's
As a
how
child,
heavily,
as
yeah,
a sort of preteen young person, gosh, that sounds absolutely terrifying, but exhausting as well. There's so many things to consider when you're a child in terms of physical development, psychological development. School is really hard and really stressful. And with all these added elements of control and horrible, hateful rhetoric and all of this commitment of just time to the way in terms of the fellowship meetings and the traveling, it sounds absolutely exhausting.
yeah. I think I never got full sleep because I had night terror, vivid night terrors, mostly of devil spirits. Um, and I was constantly in fight or flight mode. But I also had two younger siblings who I was extremely protective of, and I was constantly putting myself in the path of their punishments, and I was constantly, inserting myself to protect them. And so I don't know that I understood true rest for a really long time. And I know that that can't have been good for, emotional or physical development. You need to sleep. Like that's just the reality of things is you need to sleep soundly. You need a certain amount of sleep. You need to be able to sit down and relax and feel your muscles unclench and be able to just enjoy living in moments. And that was really hard because we were just constantly head on a swivel waiting for the next bad thing to happen, or waiting for the like devil spirit we had to fend off, or waiting to like put on the mask and be like this performative obedient child to impress other adults. It was, yeah, I think I've not really thought about it that way before, and I appreciate you saying that. It was exhausting.
I know that the sleep deprivation and the constant busyness are two counterparts that complement each other in keeping individuals preoccupied and unable to think critically. Of course, when you're somebody born and raised in a group, sets a whole different level of indoctrination in the group. But also, as you've mentioned, like trying to find out who you are, who are you aside from the group. And when you have no free identity to return to, it's difficult to begin to look at yourself and say, who am I without these teachings? Who am I without my parents? Who am I without my father's status within the way? Who am I in school when I'm not the obedient child, but I'm observing other children and how they interact with each other and what they talk about doing on weekends and where they go away to summer camp and what their summer camp looks like and sounds like in comparison to your experiences. It's a whole other field of understanding when we look at people born and raised in groups. I feel as though the parameters or of expectation and coercion onto your parents were most likely stifling, but applying those same parameters to children is a whole other thing. And you mentioned for a long time being one of the only children in your local fellowship. Was there ever a point of excitement in going away to the Rock of Ages and knowing that there would be other children around for you to interact with and not have to hide this religious side of your life because children in school might not necessarily understand it?
Oh yeah. Absolutely. So the Rock of Ages, like, was both horrific because it was just like a playground for pedophiles, basically, but it was also awesome. They flooded a parking lot and made a water park every year. They had a petting zoo. There was soft serve ice cream. There were pony rides. There were lots of children's fellowships in like these big tents. And at night, after like the main sermon, or sometimes during it, if it was like not child appropriate, we would all be ushered into these children's tents and just like put on mats and like preached at and given coloring books and then eventually like supposed to fall asleep. Like I had like this whole squad of like hundreds of children, you know, and I was just allowed to roam. So like I would just be like running in fields with children I had never met before playing. And no one knew where I was, but that was okay because I was surrounded by family. So it was like this time where you could kind of like experiment a little bit with who you are. You could like interact with children in ways that felt comfortable to you. You could make new friends. I had pen pals that I would like stick to writing with when you know, the Rock of Ages was over. There were cliques, of course, because we were children. And there were a lot of really great, fun, liberating moments in those environments.
Mm.
Um, you know, there's always a juxtaposition in my story of like some things were really good. And I think that's true for like most people in cults, whether you're born in or you enter, there's like a reason that it works. There's a reason people stay. There's positive things that occur. Like there was such a sense of community. Um, and I think that was like a huge component of like this found family. And then you had all this terrible stuff that was happening alongside it. But in some ways, I think they balanced each other out enough that people stayed in and they stayed engaged.
Mm. So you're still excited to go every year with an understanding that there will be abusers and perpetrators most likely amongst those attending, but sleuths of children who are also looking for escapism, I imagine, also looking for connection and community outside of their own local fellowships, which is quite a beautiful thing when you think about it. The kind of reckless wildness of young children all running around together. I imagine like really mucky and muddy and
Oh
you
yeah.
know, flowers in your hair. And it is important to recognize both sides. And who knows, those experiences may be some of the things that stay with people enough to keep them going. Not inside the group, but just in life, and thinking back on those experiences, those special bonding moments of just rugged children running free through the fields, a flooded parking lot. That sounds awesome.
It was awesome. There were fountains, there were slides. I mean, I think I looked forward to the Rock of Ages until my sisters were old enough to start participating in things like the children's tent and to start drawing more attention from adult men. And then, there are a lot of pictures of me laying behind them, and like I'm clearly not sleeping. Like my eyes are under a hat, my siblings like totally asleep, and I'm like physically gripping their shoulder in the pictures, because like if somebody's going to approach them or touch them, they have to go through me. Like I'm going to be aware of it, so, and there was like one man who like singled me out in that time frame. And so like the last couple of years we went, like I was not as excited, I was not comfortable. I knew like there was a specific person that was going to be seeking me out, and I also knew that my sisters were vulnerable. And so that changed some of my enjoyment. Like there were still moments of like, I'm on a pony ride, like I'm eating cotton candy till I'm sick. One of my favorite things to do at night after like the big tent, which is where Craig Martindale would typically preach, like we would chase fireflies, like there were again, like all these like really great moments, even among all of the suffering. And I think those moments are what got me through and
Yeah.
are the things that I choose now as an adult on their healing journey to like hang on to, because I have to start putting the other stuff down, which is part of the reason that
Right.
like I'm telling this story finally, as a second generation survivor. Like those stories aren't out there yet, and people are still carrying the burden. Some of the kids I grew up with are still in.
Yeah.
Some of the kids I grew up with took their own lives. Some of the kids I grew up with are living these compulsory, maybe that's the word I'm looking
Um,
for,
as
compulsory,
a compulsory or compulsive?
yeah, compulsory like heterosexual lives with like children and husbands or wives. And I was blessed. If you could, I've kind of twisted this for myself, but like I was blessed by being marked in a void. Like it saved my life, even though it was like the worst thing that ever happened at the time. Looking back on it, like one of the reasons I'm alive and happy is because that happened to us. Um, and I'm thankful that it happened, because as horrible as the couple years that followed being marked in a void were, just kind of like floundering in this new existence without the way, um, it birthed like a beautiful life, and it allowed me to find that like really like spitfire sassy little girl that just had those things like punished out of her. Like she wasn't actually like gone, she was just like deep down inside under all of the trauma and under all of the indoctrination. And so getting kicked out was a gift, and it's allowed me to be where I am now. um but I wouldn't wish my childhood on anyone.
No.
um
Without the moments of friendship and positivity, there's an entire childhood to mourn. And being able to, I know not everybody likes the term deconstruct, but be able to come out of an experience and untangle things that have happened, thoughts, feelings, and personality traits, beliefs, relationships, be able to really pull everything apart and decide what you want to keep with you and what you want to leave behind is some of the most exhaustive and difficult work that people come on this show and talk about. What do I believe in? And what do I like to do with my time? Oh no, actually, that's something that my parents would tell me I should do with my time, or that's something that Martindale would tell me I should do with my time. So being able to listen to you talk retrospectively on doing that work is so important, because there could be any number of people listening to our conversation who are in the midst of this whole jumbled up puzzle that they have to piece together and say, oh, all of those pieces, they belong to a different puzzle and I don't need that anymore. This puzzle here, this is the one I want to keep. It's got all of those parts of my childhood, but it's got all of those other amazing things that I have in my life now. And of course, that's a very simplistic way of looking at things, but it's so important to highlight all of the things you've talked about in terms of positive childhood experiences and piecing together what you keep and what you leave behind. And I also understand that that journey never really ends either. So there are still parts that you will probably recognize that you don't really need anymore and that you're going to kind of leave by the wayside as you go on. By the wayside, I didn't mean to say that. Did your parents come to recognize that you were less enthusiastic as the years went on about certain experiences or certain events that you would be expected to attend? And did your responsibilities within the group, did they, as a woman, was your role heightened at any point? Were people looking to you saying you now have these added responsibilities as you get older, as your father plays this role?
So I think there was a point where my parents started just labeling me as like the bad kid or the problem kid. They look back on it and they're like, we just didn't know what to do with you anymore. um, I had so much anger, and I had to mask it so heavily in front of other people that when it was just us behind closed doors, like my immediate family, I couldn't mask anymore. There came a point where I couldn't suppress anymore. At that point, they had done things like turn my doorknob inside out so they could lock me in my room for prolonged periods. They, used food as punishment and motivator. They really, I think, took all of the plays out of the way parenting manual and tried them with me. And I know they must have realized that my feelings towards everything had changed. At one point, there was a man who had entered our fellowship who was sexually abusing me, and he stayed. Um, and I never explicitly stated to my parents, like, hey, this is what's happening. But I had a clear aversion to this particular person. I was so angry anytime they were around. I was avoidant of them. And it wasn't until two of the other girls complained to their parents that he made them uncomfortable. And their fathers went to my father that this guy was kicked out. He was kicked out of fellowship because of the complaints of these other girls. And I started to recognize that although there were all these clear signs of abuse in my behavior and like physically, that my parents chose to ignore that. And once all of that started clicking into place, you know, I started doing a lot of like refusing to do things and like being willing to like take the punishment in order to start saying no to things. And so I think they did recognize my discomfort and my overall change in attitude. And at the same time, as I was like becoming a teenager, I was expected to monitor children's fellowship and be responsible for the younger children. I was expected to, I wouldn't call it flirty fishing. I think that's like the wrong name for it. But I was certainly expected to wear pretty dresses and put on makeup and like be out as like a face for recruitment. Um, and I think for whatever reason, my parents never saw that as a problem. Um, and again, it's like the parenting manual, it's the indoctrination, it's whatever. But this is where I often get stuck in these conversations, is where does indoctrination end and accountability begin as a parent in these organizations? Because I was obviously born in, right? I didn't have any choices. These were just, hey, these are your beliefs now. But my parents chose to join. They chose to stay in, even when they did see red flags. They chose to raise us this way. And, I was talking about this in a support group the other day. Um, and the person facilitating the group was just like, well, when the parents can see either through the child's behavior or some sort of physical evidence that abuse is occurring, that's where accountability starts.
Right.
So, yes, you're indoctrinated. Yes, you are under coercive control. And that does certainly change the conversation around parenting and around parental decisions, but it doesn't change the fact that accountability does indeed exist. And so I think I just can start talking in circles when we get to this kind of topic.
You mentioned that you were labeled mark and avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a follow on from your rebellious stage? This is obviously a trauma response in your actions, in your behavior. Well, I say obvious, through this conversation. This is a trauma response, and you're exhibiting behaviors of needing support, of needing stability, of needing to feel loved and safe. And your parents seem to be putting this down to you being a typical teenager, or going through a rebellious stage, or falling out of favor with the beliefs, and less so about you reacting to certain things happening in your life. So when you begin to act this way and your parents run out of things that they can do to make things significantly worse by the sounds of things, do you continue with this behavior, or is there a specific event that happens where you're shunned?
So it was, I think, when we were mark and avoid, we were mark and avoid as a family. And
Right.
um, there were many factors that went into us being mark and avoid, but several of them have to do with me, um, whether directly or not. So I had these tomboy tendencies. I had these homosexual tendencies, and no matter what my parents did to try to pair me with boys, I clearly had an aversion to that. And I had a big aversion to, kissing men on the mouth and all of the sort of touching that like skirts the line of appropriate. I also became ill, and as with I think a lot of cultic groups, like illness is also attributed to devil spirits. So I learned to speak in tongues and interpret, which was like this huge thing, which for me was not a true experience. I faked it because I had to, right? So like I know my parents genuinely believe that they were taught to speak in tongues, and the key here is the word, it's interpret. They were also taught to interpret what they were saying and like spit out the true word of God per Victor Werewolf. So I learned to speak in tongues and interpret. I still had these devil spirits. I did not get well. So I was having illness, I was having these homosexual tendencies, and I was also a very competitive athlete. And during this time, Craig Martindale was really asking the leadership to spend more and more time like devoted to fellowship, devoted to branch meetings, devoted to ongoing trainings on site at headquarters. And my parents made these really, for me, great decisions, like to pursue, allow me to pursue sports and to
Right.
come to my sports games and, you know, I think at this point, my dad had hit some limits and wasn't willing to give as much as Craig Martindale was asking of him. And all of these things combined led to us being market avoid. And I'm sure there are other factors that I'm totally unaware of because at the time I was a teenager. So there's probably things that went on with my parents that I'm unaware of. Um, but yeah, we were all mark and avoid as a family, and it was just done. Like literally, my parents sat us down. And were like, we were mark and avoid, and everybody that you know is going to act like you died. There were no goodbyes. There were no letters. There were no phone calls. There were no final conversations. Like all of these people in our fellowship, everybody in the extended organization, we were just dead to them.
Gosh, your parents' involvement over so much of their lives and your father's position was probably used as an example as to why everybody needs to do what Craig Martindale is telling them to do. Because your family were prominent, and if this can happen to this family, it can happen to any family. So everybody better get in line and start doing what I'm telling you to do. The adjustment period for all of you in that time must have just been horrific.
Those are some of the worst years of my life. Like they're worse than being in the cult because my parents had been in for like 30 years. They joined when they were like 19 and we were done when I was like 15. Like they were in
Oh my
for a
goodness.
really really long time, a big portion of their lives, and they didn't have many friends outside of the organization. You know, we had strained relationships with extended family, and they really, I can't imagine the trauma they were experiencing, honestly, that I was completely oblivious to, and my siblings were completely oblivious to because we were so busy dealing with our own fallout.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
but certainly their parenting changed significantly in some ways. I was left to my own devices a lot. I had no understanding of why I was so angry or like how to appropriately express my anger. I was like picking holes in walls and doors. I was punching things. I was getting into fights. I started self injuring. I started using substances. I started but I was stuck in this like heteronormative mindset. So I was dating a lot of boys. Um, there was sexual assault happening, and like my parents were just like completely checked out. They later told me, "Oh yeah, we always knew when you were high. Oh yeah, we recognized that our liquor was going missing. At least you were doing it in the house." I heard things like, my dad still to this day is like, "I just had no idea that you could possibly be gay because there were so many boys." And I looked, like I was like, "Well, you put all the boys there."
Yeah, and
Like,
also I thought we were past that point of it being a choice. We realize now that that's not the case, surely. Like, oh, but there's so many boys. You could have just chose one. That's not
right.
that's not how it works.
Right. Like there were just so many things and there were so many red flags, and my sisters were exhibiting red flags as well. It's not like they were completely untouched by this. Um, and nobody did anything is the thing. Like there was nobody that came to the rescue. The way didn't show back up. Those people who helped raise me never contacted me again. My parents were like just completely checked out and floundering, and no one. I was like in and out of the hospital with like broken bones for years and stitches and things, and like CPS, to my knowledge, was never contacted. There was just all of these moments that could have been like these pivotal changes that were never seized by anybody. And my relationship with my parents to this day is like very complicated and very strained. And sometimes I go no contact with them. Sometimes I have limited contact with them. I'm still learning to navigate all this stuff. I had to figure out my sexuality all on my own. That was a hot mess, you know, and it really wasn't until my wife basically rescued me. I met her. I was still living with my parents, sort of. I was living in my car. I was couch surfing, but technically my residence was them. And for whatever reason, she was like, All right, well, this person is lovely underneath all this um intense internalized homophobia and anger. So I'm just gonna put a hand out. And that was really one of the first hands I took. And I was 19 and we're still together. Like I'm
Wow.
37. I've been with her ever since. Like she basically like rescued me and helped me figure all of this stuff out. And as I'm still untangling it, she's so supportive. I finally found like a really great trauma therapist after years of terrible therapy. I got properly diagnosed with some physical and mental health conditions that are being treated, some of which are directly correlated to my time in the cult. I have a great career. I have a home. I have a found family. Um, my life is actually pretty beautiful. And I think part of the beauty is all of the stuff that I overcame, and I wish I didn't have to. But like, I don't know that I would appreciate what I have, the freedom that I have, the choices I'm now able to make without it. And there were so many things to navigate. Like I said, there was a point where like going out in public and being physically affectionate with my wife was just like a hard no. Like, and she had to respect that boundary, which she did for years. I didn't really understand consent. So like even though like I wanted to be intimate with her, I also just like didn't realize that I could be like, you know what, I'm really actually not in the mood right now. And that was something we had to navigate. And she's done it all with a lot of grace. Um,
Oh, wow. That's so amazing. That's so, so wonderful to hear. The patience and perhaps not understanding. I mean, I'm almost 300 interviews in at this point, and I don't, I could never truly understand your experiences because I am not coming from a position of lived experience in a cultic environment. But the want to understand is a huge thing for survivors, and the compassion and patience that comes with that want to understand is a big thing as well. To have an ally so strong to hold their hand out to you and say, come on, let's work some things out, and we'll go from there. To respect your boundaries and help you identify what those boundaries are without being coercive is a key thing, because so many times people have come to speak and say, oh, I left this environment and I ended up in this environment because it felt familiar, and that other environment is another one of abuse and coercion. So when you have this family, your biological family and your religious family, or I don't know, pseudo religion, your religious
sure.
family come together to give you conditional love and then take that away from you with no closure and no integration into society outside of that group, with no support for any of your family members and nobody to give you a helping hand. To have this one woman come to you and say unconditionally, without coercion, without abuse, let's go together and let's see if we can work some things out. It makes me like teary because it's so beautiful, and it's hope for everybody as well. It's not somebody saying, come on, come with me. Let's get into another conditional environment where you do all of these things. Otherwise, I leave you like you've already been left. Or I will perpetrate these experiences onto you like you've already experienced. To have somebody come to you and say, we can do this together, and be true in that and be safe and be wanting to understand and all of those things that you needed for so many years, it's just so wonderful. Kudos to your wife. Big shout out to your wife if she listens to this. Thank you very much.
I don't know. I'm doing a couple podcasts and I'm certainly giving her the option to listen or not. There's a lot of things that she knows about vaguely or, she's heard about, but I think listening to it in a condensed format like this for anybody who loves the survivor is probably really hard. Um, I don't have words for how thankful I am for her because, even when we met, I was dating an abusive man. The 4 years from 15 to 19 where I was just like floundering were full of abuse and coercive relationships. And people taking advantage of me, my generosity, my resources, because I was, made to work full time basically from 15 onward. So I did have financial resources, I did have a car. And so and I had no idea how to set boundaries. And I was just so happy people were paying attention to me that it was really easy to be taken advantage of. And, I was dating a pretty abusive guy when we met. And, I had had dalliances, so to speak, with women in those 4 years where I was kind of figuring out, like, oh, maybe I'm bisexual. Like, that was like my little safety net was like, I could still find like this magical dick, and this magical dick is going to make me heterosexual finally. And that was sort of like the end goal. And like, there was just, yeah, I'm attracted to women, but I will find this magical dude and that will be it. And then when I met her, there was just this connection and this safety where it was all my choice. Like, do you want to be with this guy? Like, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to give you an option. And like, no one had really done that before. I had never been given, like, you can have A or B or even C. Like, you can stay with this guy if that's really what you want. And I don't want to watch it. I'm going to walk away if that's your choice. But like, that can be your choice. You can come and try this relationship with me that I think could be really beautiful. Or I can just help you get away from him and then you can go about your life. Like, she left the ball in my court and gave me those three options. And it was really overwhelming because I had never been presented with something in that way before. And like, that just immediately cemented this trust that somebody was actually going to let me make choices. And I chose her. And I'm really, really thankful that I did.
It's a really wonderful thing when you find an individual in life who shows you a form of treatment that you've never experienced before. My partner is the most open and safest person I've ever met in my life. And I honestly didn't think that people like him existed. And even now, when he goes to make a coffee and he's like, "Do you want a hot drink?" And I'm like, "Yes, please." Even that to me is like something that I never experienced. And you're almost kind of on guard for the first few years because you're like, what's your agenda? And then you realize that, sometimes, even though you have bad experiences with bad people, or, you have good experiences with good people who are also sometimes bad, you do come across individuals who protect you and keep you safe, and it is unconditional, and it's the most powerful thing. So I hope everybody listening has that person
Me
or those
too. It's
people.
because the people out there who are listening that are still in it, whether they're actually still in an organization or they're in a coercive relationship of some kind, or they're out of those relationships but are floundering like I was for those years, like, that person does exist and that person could take many forms. They're not necessarily going to be a romantic partner. They don't have to be a romantic partner, but there's going to be that person who puts their hand out. And it's really hard to recognize that hand sometimes. So it's hard, but like, holding on to the hope that it exists, I can tell you that it does. And I could say that till I'm blue in the face, but my hope for everybody is that they do get to experience that hand and they choose that hand. Um, and that really can open the world to so many possibilities. Um, and you also can't just do it for someone else. Like, the healing has to be prompted by a need for it or a desire for it. Um, and I really wanted out. I was so trapped and I really had hit a point where I needed and wanted out if I was going to survive. Um, and so I hope that everybody out there who's in a similar state that I was in can hear this and say, like, okay, maybe there is something out there, and you might not just get the hand. You might have to seek it. And I think that's really scary because, like, even with my wife's support, like, I had to decide that I was going to go to therapy. I had to decide I was going to allow myself to have relationships with people that weren't going to be sexualized. I could just hug a friend that's a boy, and that's okay. It's not going to lead to anything else. I had to let myself experience that. I had to start sharing parts of myself. Like, I don't have like in real life friends where I've like sat down and like laid out my experience in this way, but I have friends who understand that I did grow up in a cult and I do have trauma, and like that love and accept me unconditionally in spite of or because of that. I have my support group. So for those of you who listen to a bunch of cult podcasts, you probably listen to Indoctrination with Rachel Bernstein, and she has a support group, and that support group has changed my life. Um, Finding other survivors to talk to, even if you're not ready to get out, it just opens a little window or a crack in a window. Um, there are
Yeah,
those
there are a few people
connections.
that have been on the podcast that are a part of that support group, and a few that are part of Yanya Lalich's groups as well, and also of the Family Survival Trust. So if anybody listening doesn't have that person or those people right now, we will be those people. You can contact me. I can put you in touch with M. You can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com. We will have those conversations. We can signpost to some really amazing support groups, but also I just appreciate getting emails from people. Sometimes people just want to talk. Sometimes people want to make comments on episodes they've listened to. Some people want to reach out and tell their story. If you are looking for somebody, there are people, and we can be those people until we find a wider network of people. And then all together, without being culty in any way, we will be a community that helps other people heal.
Absolutely. And people can certainly find me and reach out to me on social media or via email. I'm on Instagram as Mark and Avoid. Um, and I have a Gmail. It's I am Mark and Avoid at gmail.com. Someone took Mark and Avoid at gmail.com already. So if that person is listening and you're a survivor of the way, please do get in touch. But I am especially interested in connecting with second generation, third generation survivors. I think that our situations are significantly different than people who go in as adults. I'd love to connect with adult survivors. And by adult survivors, I mean folks who entered the way as adults. First generation members of the cult, I'm also very open to connecting with, but second generation, third generation survivors of any cultic organization, if you want to talk, I definitely have an ear to listen, and I'm terrible at checking messages, but I swear I'll get back to you if you reach out.
Just a couple of comments I wanted to make before we finish today. The kissing on the mouth. I did an interview with somebody from the German Baptist Brethren Church, or the German Brethren, no, it's the German Baptist Brethren Church. And the men greet each other by kissing on the mouth.
Huh.
But the men kissing the women on the mouth, or the men kissing the girls on the mouth, reminds me of Keith Raniere from Nexium. So again, we're just getting people cherry picking parts of other people's things and just saying, this is our thing now. And it's all very strange, and it's all very creepy. And we should do less mouth kissing of people that we don't know or want to do mouth kissing with, or any type of kissing. And also a point to make before we finish up today is that these conversations are more prevalent than ever. If there are people now joining the way, it's 2023, so we're 23 years past the big kind of information coming out of abuses and allegations. And if the numbers are going up again, there's a chance that enough rebranding has happened, enough splinter groups have moved away from, well, Martindale's names being taken off of maybe some things that are listed on the website. If there is this effort to bury all of the controversies and abuses and harassment and exploitation that has taken place, not just on a sexual level, but financially, physically, if there is a chance that that information is far enough away in a timeline that people are now coming to the Way International without any knowledge that these things have happened, we have to keep these conversations coming. We have to keep them relevant. It doesn't have to be on a podcast. It can be in support groups, in blog posts, on forums, talking about it with your local representative of government, of political seats, because we can't let the numbers grow if the environments are still as abusive as they have been, or if they're abusive at all. So it's incredible that we've been able to have this conversation today. Thank you so much. I had no idea that this group was on the rise again. I don't know if you think if there are any other things that we can be doing to really shine a light on this subject, to make people aware so that there are informed decisions before people join groups like the Way International.
Yeah, I think that that's huge. And that's honestly one of my main motivators in starting to talk, because like I'm really just dipping my toe into all of this. This is my second time being interviewed for a podcast, you know. But there aren't those stories. And if you Google the Way International, like the abusive things all fall to the bottom. You really have to dig. If you go on Instagram and you look at the hashtag the Way International, myself and like two other people use that hashtag to talk about the way being abusive, and everything else is these positive, very well polished and manicured things. And so when you're looking at these organizations, you have to do some due diligence. You have to be responsible for your own decision making. But we as survivors, I think, and supporters of survivors can make it easier for that information to be acquired by sharing our stories, by using those hashtags, so that when people are searching for the Way International or the ILBP or the IBLP, sorry, those letters are easily reversible, you know, but we're looking at these organizations that exist, Scientology, whatever it may be, that there are things to combat all of the really well polished information that the organization is putting out there. Because I think that's a big piece of the problem, is like it's very difficult to find these stories and to have access to the information. So putting it out there, as like scary as it is to do, I think is so important. And if you're listening and you're not involved, but you happen to live in Ohio, please contact your representatives, because they are a tax exempt church. They do have positive press in local papers about things they're doing in the community. And they're also a highly abusive, coercive, controlling organization that is doing damage to people still. And you know, you can find these books on Amazon. You can go on Amazon and you can read The Power for Abundant Living. Like that should not, and obviously there's, you can get into all kinds of First Amendment things here, but like that should not be what comes up first when you search for these things. The things that should come up first is, this is a cult, this group has done damage, and the only way we can make that happen is by sharing and is by speaking out. So all the other survivors out there, thank you for sharing your stories. It's powerful and it's so important.
Thank you for sharing your story. You said this is your second podcast, and you've come here today and you've given us an entire encyclopedic history of the Way International, peppered with your own experiences, which allows us to understand just how abusive and coercive this group is and has been, and why it's important that we do what we can to continue to raise awareness around not just the Way International, but other groups that are all still taking all of these parts of various playbooks and adopting them into their own abusive practices. I so appreciate you and your time, and I'm so happy to sit here today and talk to you about your beautiful life that you've carved out for yourself after everything.
Thank you so much. It was just an absolute pleasure. I'm so excited to have been interviewed for your show, and I really appreciate the platform. It means an awful lot to me and to lots of other people too.
Thank you very much, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much.
Bye.